Thank you, Dr. G. To be able to be sitting on the same stage as Ambassador Saran, and then to be described in very nice terms along with him is one of those moments when you think, okay, now I can retire happy. So this is great. Um, so I'm not gonna, go through Ambassador Saran's bio again. It's incredibly long, but I'm gonna pick up on two things that Dr. Gopinath mentioned that you all already know. One is that he was the special envoy on the Indo-US civil nuclear issue and the special envoy on climate change. And I think these two things are really important because they are incredibly connected. The other thing that I'm going to pick up on is that after he retired from the Foreign Service, he was part of several different organizations, and I believe they were very well thought through as to what were the organizations to be a part of, including the World Wildlife Fund and FICCI, right? Also two areas that I think are very important to be connected. Maybe they were a little bit by default, but I'm going to imagine that they were by design, and so we'll go along with that. And so I want to begin, and Dr. Gopinath already had a few questions for you, but before we get to the questions that she had, I want to begin a little bit more broadly, right? Given your work in India's foreign policy and the changes that you have seen, how we conduct our foreign and security policy over the last several decades, and how we conduct the way we think about climate, what are the kind of changes you have seen, both positive and negative, perhaps, and how do you see the question of foreign and security policy connected to climate going forward? Because at Kubernein, the kind of research that we do and the work that I have done, I don't think these are separate issues. And for too long, we have seen foreign and security policy and climate security, the conversations have happened in parallel. Now they're coming together, but not nearly enough. So if you could comment a little bit on the change that you have seen from your perspective, and then how do we bring these two conversations together more closely?
Ambika, thank you very much. And let me thank Meenakshi for those very generous words that she spoke about me. Every time Meenakshi speaks, I grow about 2 inches taller. So she is always very good for my ego. Climate change is something that I feel very passionately about, I might say. Because through my experience as chief negotiator on climate change, and as you mentioned, the Indo-US nuclear deal as well, the learning that I have had is that precisely what you said, that many of these strands which seem to be separate actually are completely intertwined together. So today, I don't think about climate change as being in one particular box, environment being in another box, biodiversity being something else. All these are interconnected. And I think one of the good things that has happened is that the SDGs, perhaps for the first time in those 17 SDGs, recognized all these interconnections. So to give you a very simple example, take the issue of, say, food security, water security, energy security. Now, for food security in India, we adopted what proved to be, at a certain point of time, an extremely successful initiative, the Intensive Agriculture Development Program. What did it consist of? You had small plots of land for the farmer, let him use hybrid seeds, let him use chemical fertilizers, later on pesticides, lots and lots of water, and your crop yields will increase. And yeah, they did increase. So that was the Green Revolution. You know. What we did not recognize in this focus on crop yields for food security was that over a period of time, all that use of chemical fertilizers completely ruined the natural fertility of the soil. So every year, you had to use even more chemical fertilizers in order to get, again, that same yield as before. Because of this intensive agriculture, you also had lots of pests around you. Therefore, you could not deal with them without using more and more toxic pesticides. Water. You have to use more and more water because you're using more chemical fertilizers. Uh, Should it be a surprise that the water table starts going down? And we are today facing a major problem in terms of water security. Now, so you see the connection here that in pursuing food security, we have ended up by many other, collateral damage, which we did not take into account. Much more than that. When I was doing climate change work, that was also the time that you had these stories about, farmer suicides in Andhra, in some of the other southern states. When we started actually going into why these suicides were taking place, the general sense was because crop failure. They were using hybrid seeds. Suddenly, there was some pest, some problem with drought, and the crop failed, and therefore they became bankrupted, and therefore they could not meet their debts, and therefore committed suicide. What we discovered was that they were being bankrupted not because of crop failure, they were being bankrupted by health costs. Why? Because they were constantly exposed to toxic chemicals, fertilizers, no protective gear. They were spraying toxic pesticides, getting into their, respiratory system, having, skin diseases, uh, eye problems because of this exposure. So you look at the linkage here. You have food security, water security, health security. All of these are linked together. So the person who's actually doing food security is not bothered about what happens with respect to health security or what is happening with respect to, water security. So those connections are extremely important, what you said. And I could, extend this to many other things. So the first order of business is that in dealing with the issue of climate change or environment and the issue of gender security, you need to take into account all these interconnections. We live in a world which is really put together with very, very fragile threads. You break one thread here and it starts unraveling. What we are facing today is precisely that unraveling which is taking place. This fabric of life that we have been with us. That fabric of life, if you take one strand out, don't be surprised if the other strands also start breaking up. So this is a problem. Meenakshi spoke about the life initiative. Yes, it is about life because it is all interconnected. Now, with regard to what you said about did I choose various pursuits after my retirement? Not really. I mean, these were coincidences. But as a practitioner of Zen, I believe there are no coincidences in life. That was the first thing I learned from my Roshi, my master, when I, again, because of coincidence, I went to him and I said, "Oh, what a coincidence that I have landed up here." And he says, "Never, life, there is no coincidence." So maybe I think it is coincidence. Maybe there was some karma which sort of brought that about. But let me end this part by saying that, the role of women in whatever challenge we are talking about. What has been the issue is, treating this as an add-on. Oh, we are doing everything. Let's put gender also into this. Let's supplement this. It is not supplemental. It is integral. So unless you have a mainstreaming of gender in whatever discourse you are having, you're not going to get very far. Because it's like saying, yes, we must ensure that there are more women, for example, in the boardroom, or we must ensure that there are more women diplomats in the foreign service. That's not the issue. The issue is really how do you mainstream this into whatever discourse that you are having. In this respect, I would say that one of the great things about India is that some of the challenges that you are facing, actually, if you look at your own traditions, your own culture, here is a country which treats nature as a mother, not as a man. Nature is mother. Nature is source of nurture. That is what nature is all about. And what we have lost is that view of nature. Because in the West, nature is a dark force to be conquered and harnessed to human need, maybe human greed as well. That is how you treat developmental process is how do I harness nature more and more to human need. Now, this is where I think people talk about, have you crossed a red line? Have you gone beyond the tipping point? The tipping point is not being set by you. The tipping point, that red line, has been set by nature. If you cross that line, then you are going to be in trouble. So I think the sense that we had in India, never take from nature more than she can actually regenerate, because she's inexhaustible in a sense, but not quite. If you extract more from nature than she can regenerate, then you are going to end up in a disastrous kind of situation. So I will, with respect to that overall, perspective in terms of the framework that Meenakshi is talking about, this is what I would like to put forward. Then maybe I can answer some of your specific questions.
Yes, thank you. You've actually made my job really easy because you've answered quite a few of my questions already. But I'm going to pick up on something that you said about integration. And at Kubernein Initiative, that's one of the things that we are trying to do. What we've seen is a gap in some of the work that's being done in India when we look at security policy, climate, or even gender work. And a lot of these conversations are happening in separate boxes. And we said, we'll try and fill those gaps and bring those conversations together. We don't need to always reinvent the wheel. We just need to see what's there and what fits well. And so I think that concept of integration is important and it's necessary. In November, you had given an interview where you basically used the phrase "decade of despair" for this coming decade, and I thought that was. And I'm taking it a little bit out of context, but it was an interview with LiveMint. If anyone would like to read that article. And so I'm going to park that. So the decade of despair that's coming now, or that we are already in, depending on whom you ask. So last weekend, I was at the Munich Security Conference, and I had the absolute pleasure of moderating a panel on women, peace, and security. And the president of Kosovo, who's an amazing woman, so the panel was on women, peace, and security, but I asked a question about climate change and the relationship to women, peace, and security. And I think all the panelists were a little bit surprised, but she talked about how their women, peace, and security conversation in Kosovo that she is spearheading is very closely connected to climate change. And I think that's an amazing discussion that they're having in Kosovo. And she also used the phrase "decade of despair," but she used it in the context of the past, that they have gone through that, and because of the conversation, the nature in which the conversation has changed, she's a lot more hopeful for the coming years. And so I wanted to ask you then, following up on this idea of integration, do you think that a better form of integration in our conversations, specifically looking at integrating gender and climate and then peace and security, might be the counter for this decade of despair?
There are many hopeful things happening. I mean, one must always have hope. So, I mean, even when I talked about the decade of despair, it was to at least, spur some kind of thinking about, if you don't acknowledge the scale of the challenge you are facing, how do you deal with it? I think there is a tendency to feel that actually we are getting there. We are not getting there. I think one should be honest enough to recognize that. But what I would guard against is that somehow we have got ourselves into a state of mind which seems to think that this is the age of technology, this is the age of artificial intelligence, this is machine learning, so many great things are happening. Look at the way in which we were able to come up with vaccines for the pandemic. Yes, there are technological marvels, but I think the attitude of technological determinism is a very dangerous attitude. That is arrogance, technological arrogance that we are actually suffering from, where we think that we will find a technological solution to this. Green hydrogen, if you drill down and see what the challenges are, I am not so sure that it is the easy answer to what we are looking at. I'm also very surprised, for example, when I was doing climate change work, the carbon capture and storage was a great thing, and we were being pushed by the West. You should be looking at this as a major, answer to our problems. Then 10 years, nobody talked about it because, if you had a $1 billion, 1,000 megawatt coal-based thermal plant, you would need another billion to retrofit it for, carbon capture and storage. And in India, we did an exercise. If you take out the carbon, pump it through pipeline to a place where there are caverns, geological features where storage is possible, and then you have to pump it down into the cavern and seal it. It was actually not net net carbon negative. It was actually you were ending up by using more energy in doing carbon capture than you were actually saving. So people forgot about it. I am surprised to see that it has come back again into our discourse. I sometimes feel that if I have been out of these active negotiations now for 13 years, okay, I finished in 2010. I sometimes have a feeling that if suddenly the government decided to make me a chief negotiator again, and I would go back to the negotiations, I could start without any difficulty because nothing has changed in terms of those negotiations. You are exactly where you were. So this is depressing, and I think we have to recognize that this. And then you see some of the kind of sleight of hand which is taking place. The biggest fraud to me is global net zero. It is not zero. Somehow people have got into their head that global net zero is zero emissions. It is not zero emissions. What you are saying is that by 2050, whatever emissions are still coming out, you are going to be able to compensate them by carbon reduction. Where is that reduction going to come from? So even for India, the question that you asked about 2070, how do we know? What is going to be that compensatory mechanism? I know of only two which are actually quite viable. One is forests, the other is oceans. Look at what you are doing to your forests. look at what you're doing to your oceans. The ability of the oceans to really absorb, greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, that is being, systematically decimated by dumping of, plastics into the oceans. All kinds of hazardous chemicals, overfishing, destruction of, coral reefs. So how is the ocean going to act as a carbon sink? There is a whole marine life chain, starting from planktons, going right up to whales. This is all a chain. And what are you doing? If planktons are destroyed because of the acidification of the oceans or the warming of the oceans, this whole food supply chain is gone. There are much easier ways of dealing with the carbon issue by making sure that your oceans are clean, by making certain that you don't cut forests, making certain that a tree growing in a forest is more valuable than a tree which is cut and sold as timber. If that economics does not change, if timber is still going to be more valuable in the marketplace than a tree growing in the forest, don't be surprised if forests are cut. So these are more, I would say, existential questions. What we are talking about is really on the surface. At the end of the day, this is an issue of values. What are the values by which humanity lives? You deal with rivers. I was very happy to hear that you have been doing work on the Nile and, on the Brahmaputra. Simple thing. Rivers, you will agree, are living systems. They are not pieces of property that you can chop into and say, this is mine, this is mine. This is what you have today, right? You have the Indus Basin in Pakistan saying, this is mine. Indus Water Treaty is under threat because, this is my piece of property. How dare you intrude into my property? Rivers cannot be treated like pieces of property. Therefore, the issue of foreign policy. Can you devise a foreign policy which enables you to look at these natural assets as, in fact, common, heritage? Because if you don't teach them as common heritage, how will you survive? So in South Asia, we have sovereign independent countries. You have a problem of melting of glaciers. Can India by itself, even if it has a large part of the Himalayan range, solve this problem by itself? No, it can't. Unless Bhutan is included, unless Nepal is included, unless even Pakistan is included, how do you deal with the issue of melting of glaciers? Similar to the problem of rivers. There are today, around India itself, there are what are known as maritime dead zones. That is, there are zones where no life exists. Why? Because, from the river, all the pesticides, chemicals which are being used for agriculture, they are all flowing down into the bay and destroying everything. So, forgive me if I feel pessimistic. Forgive me for saying I think it is a decade of despair, because I think there is a certain collective blindness with which we are suffering. And I think this is where your role is critical. Because, as I said, you are far more connected, and what Meenakshi said, you are far more connected to nature than others are. There is a kind of an innate understanding of the kind of challenge that we face. And that is a very valuable resource. This is why I said, it's not a question of how do I bring in gender by putting more women here. That's not the issue. The issue is precisely how do you mainstream this, so that there is a change in the mindset. Because without a change here, I'm afraid other things will not change.
Thank you. That was, I think that's a good place also. And I'm very shameless about plugging in the work that we are doing because I feel like it's important. And the more people know, the more people we have with us on that. And so a change in mindset is absolutely right because that's exactly what some of the feminist foreign policy conversation in Europe is about. It's about structural change. It's about creating systems that are different. And so the people who are working within and along with those systems have a different place that they are coming from already. It's not to add on and perpetuate those same systems, but create systemic change in itself. And we've been doing research to try and understand what that might mean in India. And some of it's positive, and some of it is not so positive. But we are at it. We are dogged and at it. I'm going to ask you one final question before I open it up to everybody who's here. And you talked a little bit, but before that, I wanted to say, along with the forests and the oceans, we also have the wetlands and the marshlands that are huge carbon sinks, which are also being destroyed. And we have some great experts who work on that if they want to pick up on that later. But so my final question here is on our global governance systems. Then we need collective thinking change to happen across the world. Of course, within India and South Asia, but across the world, and our global governance systems, I think, are not any more equipped for that. So the question is, what kind of change do you think needs to happen? Do we just get rid of the existing systems and build new ones, which I don't think is reasonable and credible, though a lot of people are calling for that? Or how do we then change these systems that are old and rooted in these norms that you're saying aren't useful anymore going forward?
So, as far as the governance aspect is concerned, when I spoke about mindset change, there is also how do countries interact with one another, the interrelationship amongst countries, which is what foreign policy is all about. What needs to change there? So I always give this example that as a negotiator, what was my brief? My brief was, you go to this conference, you give as little as possible, you extract as much as you can. That's a simple, very simple brief. And I believe that is the brief virtually every diplomat has from whichever country he is who goes to these multilateral negotiations. And your success is what? Your success is how much have you managed to extract and how little have you given. And you will see those strains today also in our foreign policy. In our foreign policy, in Chinese foreign policy, in Russian foreign policy as well. If you have that brief, and everybody has that brief, should it surprise you that we end up with a least common denominator result? Because the only thing that you can agree upon is the minimum possible. So this is the story of much of the multilateral negotiations that we are talking about. It may be okay for, say, something like trade, perhaps. But when you are facing issues which you yourself say are extraordinary challenges to the survival of humanity itself, you look at the discourse, it's all climate change is like the, the biggest challenge humanity has faced. If it is the biggest challenge that humanity has faced, is this the way to deal with it? To come up with only a least common denominator result? So you need a change which says, let me go there with the maximum that I can give. Okay. And the minimum that I need to hold on to. Then you end up with a very different result. So instead of a competitive frame within which negotiations take place, are you ready to have a collaborative frame through which those negotiations take place? By the way, it is not something that you have not done before. There are areas in which you have actually managed to work together. Take the Montreal Protocol, for the ozone layer. we did manage to get a result which was equal to the task. See, the issue is not only with respect to climate change. Most of the challenges that you are facing today, these are cross-cutting, cross-national, global in dimension. No single country, no matter how powerful it is in a position to, it has the ability, has the capability to be able to actually resolve these issues. You need to have collaborative responses. You cannot have coercive responses. So we saw that with the pandemic, isn't it? Here is a challenge which recognizes no national borders. If it starts from one remote corner in Africa, it can sweep right across the world. How are you going to stop it? Only way you can stop it is if you have a system of governance which is really collaborative, which is able to monitor what is happening in various parts of the world and is able to deal with it quickly. Now, if we say the existing, institutions of governance are not, capable of or are not up to the task, who runs these institutions? These are member states. Why do you say that the United Nations has become completely powerless? You have made it powerless because there are member states who will determine how far the UN can go. It is member states who will determine how much resources they have to do what they are supposed to do. So I don't buy the argument that, wholesale, just to get rid of the current institutions. I think what you need to do is, yes, you have to adapt them. Yes, you have to try and empower them. Both in terms of what they are able to do in terms of authority, but also empower them in terms of resources that you make available to them. If you do that, you will have a different kind of a situation. But multilateralism, the kind of crisis of multilateralism which we face today is that multilateral platforms are becoming contestations for nations. They are not for collaboration. So we have to try and look at how for things like, say, global public health, like climate change, environment, biodiversity, what are the ways in which we can actually create platforms where we can work together. And I think this is where I would like to conclude by responding to what Meenakshi said. What is that India can do? What is it that, as G20 chairman, is possible for India to do? What kind of leadership? Now, here I think one is in its conception, Life Initiative is a fantastic initiative. But I think we have to go beyond just the concept and the buzz around it, and really see what is it that we can make it make practical use of it. The second thing is that you also, I think, touched upon that the very pattern of development that we are currently wedded to me, it is a dead end. There is no place in the world today for another China. The scale which India has, if you try to mimic the same energy intensive, resource intensive strategy of development which China followed, which was, by the way, mimicking what the Western countries had followed. If you try to mimic that is not all the resources in the world, not all the fossil fuels in the world, or any other resource in the world can actually sustain your growth. So whether you like it or not, you have to look for another strategy of growth. And if you are able to pioneer another strategy of growth, not only is it good for India, but it will be really a model for other countries, because most other countries are facing the same problem. China is already locked into that energy intensive and resource intensive pattern of economic activity. For China to retrofit now is very difficult. Most of your infrastructure remains to be built in India. Therefore, you have the opportunity, the possibility of actually pursuing a different path to development. And that path exists. The great thing about India is no matter where you travel in this country, you see the most incredible innovations all over this country at the village level, at the small town level. What is lacking in this country is how do I create a national platform where I can actually pull these things together and scale them up. That's a management problem, you know. And that is where I think, people like you can actually make a huge difference. Because you can see what is happening around you. You can see for yourself the kind of innovations which are taking place. And if you can just perform that role of bringing it together, enthusing people about it, it makes all the difference. So going back to what happened in Andhra with these farmers' suicide, who were the people who actually led the recovery? They were women self-help groups. They were the instrument of change that actually came about. This is a very little known story, but it is a story which is worth telling and people actually understanding what is happening. So, all power to your elbow. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, our next panel is going to talk a little bit about some of these ideas and little lesser known stories. So do you have a few minutes for a couple of questions? Sure. Yes, so we can take a couple of questions if anyone has them. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sapna Kedia from ICRW.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I am perhaps going to follow your tone and talk a little bit about despair, but also at the same time remaining hopeful. I think we extract so much from nature because we always refer to nature as our mothers. And I think that's what we do as a world. We extract and extract from women. We never get tired of doing that. So I think one of the things in this whole discourse is that we're constantly talking about how women are change makers, women run the food at home, water, health, and women can make the change. But as a young person, I often feel cynical. I feel that we are again passing the buck to women. Why does the accountability, why in our discourse, the way we articulate gender and climate change, why does the accountability pass on to women? And that links me to my second point about what you said about development, about economics, right? We must talk about development being driven by masculine norms. How are gendered norms driving development? And how is this impacting not just women, men, but people of all genders? And where does this vicious circle end? I think that's very important because very often when we talk about gender and climate change, we sometimes land up putting the onus on women. And this is really about a larger issue about gender norms, about masculine norms of development, and its impact on men, women, and people of all genders. So I think my reservation comes from the fact that perhaps we have to move away from calling nature our mother, right? Because we extract so much. The moment we think of nature as a female figure, we think of sacrifice, we think of caregiving, we think of, unlimited resource of perseverance. That's my...
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll take another
sure.
question. Smita.
Ambassador Saran, Smita Sharma here. Just two quick questions. One, because you mentioned that multilateral platforms have really become about contestations, not collaborations. Would you say that COP has kind of failed in the task? Has COP failed as a platform for the real negotiations to happen? We see a lot of buzz around loss and damages, the reparation, but really, who's going to put the money where the mouth is? Again, something not decided upon. And second, a slightly contrarian view, maybe, because, while she argues that you should not put the onus on women, but my point is that even in terms of the evolution that you've seen towards gender inclusivity, and I'm not just talking about women, but how much of it is really to do with the optics and how much of it is to do with the real decision-making process in driving that? You may have a gender inclusive panel, but how much of that is actually sort of the decision maker there in the room?
Yes, please.
Aditi Kapoor. So I agree that nothing has changed in the negotiations, and I've been following
Something
them.
has changed.
So that something is interesting because I think India was extremely defensive earlier in the negotiations, and I think that's definitely been a complete turnaround where India now wants to lead the negotiations in terms of the conceptual frameworks, where it needs to go. And I think in that sense, the G20 leadership and the whole emphasis on life is extremely important because really that is the solution. You spoke about forests and rivers, and I would also speak about land because Jal, Jangal, Zameen is the three natural resources that we have to protect. And I think the whole emphasis now on organic agriculture, millets, and it's essentially the women who are taking this forward, though they are nowhere in the picture, when it comes to anything that matters. I think these are the points that we need to bring up now and change that decade of despair into decade of hope. So I think we've reached that turning point, which we did not have earlier in the negotiations, but now we do. And now the world is listening to India. So that's where my pessimism of the mind and the optimism of the heart comes together. Thank you.
Any other? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry.
Very quick question. I'm from a security background, as you know, National Security Council, all that. So we looked at government. So I'm going to come down from the really intellectual, solid stuff here to really mundane.
I hope I was not.
No, the questions were I was so impressed with those questions. I don't have that knowledge on climate or on women. My question is implementation.
Yes.
None of the climate the commitments that we talk of is there on the ground. For example, I'm giving an ordinary example. You put on a bunch of trees and everyone says, here are trees, and the electricity department comes and chops them all down. Okay. Second, the solution I'm looking at very quickly is, can we bring these life concepts into policy on the ground in certain specific areas like construction? The builder industry is ruining this country right across. From Kerala, I went to Kerala, I was horrified to see. Can we bring this as laws that if you build a X thing, you have to build its energy, you have to build its waste, you have this much of greenery into even the small builders. All of us know in Delhi what's going on. They are ruined. So what we don't have, I saw this in NSCS, even in the high fund security, we don't have a platform at the state where you can bring departments together and implement. Did you see anything?
So even if there are
Ambassador
laws...
Saran,
Sorry.
sorry, one moment. I think Sally might be able to answer that question actually more specifically.
Okay.
But if you want to
So
go
I
through,
will leave it to
if
her
you want
to
to go
answer.
through the others before.
Sorry, Ambassador Saran, Saili
Yeah.
from NIUA.
Yes.
Actually, I'm coming from an urbanist perspective. I think that if you are talking of climate change, I find it really absurd that when 70%, the major onus of climate change actually lies on cities as first responders. Whether you're talking of an earthquake or COVID or anything else, the first responders are cities. And you're talking of 50% population of those cities as women. So why is it that in many of these negotiations, and even in COP, I think it's the first time this time that we've seen cities even being mentioned. So you put so much on them, but they are not on the table. So it's like, nothing about me without me, not only for women, but not for cities as well. So your response.
Yeah. So all great questions. I'm not... So why do I say that nature is a mother? And is it not shifting the responsibility again to women? Not really. What we are saying is that not that there is a masculine and there is a feminine, but there is humanity made up of both men and women. So I think it would also be wrong to sort of pose this in a kind of a contradiction between the male and the female. I think what message one should be trying to get across is that both are absolutely indispensable to any kind of solution that you're looking for to many of these challenges which you have said. So it's not a question of is this shifting the blame or shifting the responsibility on somebody else, or women shifting the blame onto the men and saying they are actually the responsible for everything. To maybe some extent they are. But I think that is not the way I look at it. I do feel that there is a certain kind of natural link between the way women have led their lives, the kind of experiences, life experiences that they go through, that makes them much more sensitive to the the natural world than perhaps the more aggressive male is. So I do not think that you should look upon this as creating another way of suppressing women. No, I don't feel that. With regard to I think what you mentioned about it was about the COP. So I have been following these negotiations at least since 2007. Or because I also took part in the Rio Convention, so that was the high point, in terms of actually a global response to a very major existential challenge. If I look at the graph from then to the present, it's a declining graph. It's not that you have actually increased your responses to the challenge of climate change. It is actually declined. What did 2007 Bali roadmap say? We are facing a challenge which is perhaps more urgent than what we had faced before. Therefore, what should we do? We must enhance the implementation of the principles and provisions of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the Rio Convention. So that was what you were saying, that we will enhance the implementation of whatever we have agreed upon. From 2007 onwards, it was all going down. Even the legal basis for reductions in emissions by the developed countries, the Kyoto Protocol, who undermined it? Who made it completely irrelevant? Not India. So the kind of, you talked about, India being defensive. I contest that. I was not defensive as a negotiator. All that I was saying was, please implement what you have agreed upon in this convention. You have legally committed yourself to these things that you have to do. Just implement them. So to say the Indians were trying to, place every blame on the Western countries and were not willing to do anything themselves, that they wanted the right to, spew as much carbon as they wanted in the atmosphere, that's not the case. That was a caricature of the Indian position. And the West is very good at it. Yeah. So to say that, we were defensive and now we have become more, sort of forward-looking, not really. See what happened in Paris. I think the Prime Minister has done great things, but in Paris we gave up the most fundamental principle of the UNFCCC, which was historical responsibility. So it all became now, forget about the past, now let us look at what we can do. So now you are the troublemaker because your emissions are going up, our emissions are coming down. Even the Chinese have plateaued their emissions. Maybe at 27% of the global volume, but they are okay. So to say that somehow, we have to take a more forward position, Western countries will say, oh, the fate of the world is in your hands. Please don't be taken in by that. This is, India has to do what it must. And that brings me to the question of, how do we reconcile this with our developmental prospects? So this is why I said, actually, the good news is that what you really need to do for sustainable development is actually good for global climate change. Because decisions that you take on energy, decisions that you take, for example, on how will you construct your transportation sector, decisions that you take on how you develop your agriculture going forward, these will have an impact not only on you, but it will have an impact globally. That is where your leverage lies. So if we are talking about what role can India play in the G20, this is the role you can play. Because you are in a position to show a different path of development. That this development must also include, or the concept of affluence must also include, that I have a green earth to walk on, that I have a fresh water to drink, that I have clean air to breathe. These are also part of affluence. So if you change the discourse, nature of the discourse, and if you change the narrative, that itself is a very, very big step forward. So with respect to the negotiating forum, how has that actually developed over the last several years? To me, having seen Rio, having seen 2007, since then actually it has been coming down. So loss and damage, this is a deflection. Do you think one penny will come to you from that? And lastly, I 100% agree with you that the urban challenge is going to be the most critical challenge going forward. And yes, we started with smart cities, but I don't know what has happened to those. Because that was I think, opening for doing the kind of things that we needed to do. We have not been able to do that. Just to make certain that at least I deflect some of the blame on myself as the person who was also involved in the National Action Plan on Climate Change. I did include sustainable urbanization as one of the missions. And not much came of it, but at least we made a effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for
very
your
much,
attention. Sorry,
Ambassador Saran. You've eaten up a little bit into everybody's tea time, but I think they'll be okay with that. I invite, yes. Since we're celebrating the year of millets. And after that, I invite everybody for tea. If you'd like to pick up your tea and bring it in, because we have run over time, and I normally don't do that, but it's very hard when Ambassador Saran is saying such amazing things. I didn't want to cut him off at any point. So if you want to pick up your tea, coffee, and then come back inside, we'll reconvene.
You're not allowed to.
Oh, you're not allowed to do that. Oh, no. Okay. So please drink your tea, coffee very quickly, and then we'll reconvene in 10 minutes.
Thank you. I've been writing about this since 2013, so I'm very happy to hand you this.
Ambassador Saran, thank you very much. It was wonderful
And
to
I
meet
would
you.
certainly like to hear more about your
I
work
would,
on rivers, because